December 23, 1944. Near 8:45 hours. Road junction near Bastogne, Belgium. Oberst Friedrich von Lüttwitz stood in the cupola of his command half-track, studying the road ahead through Zeiss binoculars. The morning air bit at his exposed face, -15°C, but for the first time in 7 days he could actually see more than 50 meters. The fog that had protected his division since December 16 had finally lifted, revealing crystalline blue skies stretching to the horizon. Perfect. His 2nd Panzer Division had covered 40 kilometers in the past week, advancing through the Ardennes forests, while American aircraft sat grounded by weather. Bastogne lay just 15 kilometers ahead, surrounded, cut off, ripe for capture. After that, Antwerp after Antwerp perhaps negotiated peace. The Führer's gamble was working. Von Lüttwitz lowered his binoculars, watching his column stretch behind him along the narrow forest road. 47 vehicles, Panthers, half-tracks, supply trucks, mobile artillery, the war's reality compressed into a single vulnerable line snaking through frozen Belgian countryside. His radioman climbed up beside him. Herr Oberst, forward reconnaissance reports the road clear too. The sound stopped him mid-sentence. A low rumble, distant but growing. Not artillery, not tanks. Von Lüttwitz had heard enough engines in 5 years of war to know immediately what was coming. Aircraft. He raised his binoculars toward the eastern horizon where the sound originated. The sky was filling with dots. Small at first, growing large, silver shapes catching morning sunlight. Coming fast. Jabots, he whispered. Fighter bombers. The Americans called them P-47 Thunderbolts. His men called them Jabots, short for Jagbomber, or sometimes Metzgers. The butchers. But this wasn't a flight of 4 or 6. This was. He started counting. Lost track. Started again. 40, 50, 60. They kept coming. The first wave, 48 aircraft in precise formation, was already beginning their dive. From 12,000 feet, they rolled inverted and plummeted toward his column like silver hammers falling from heaven. Take cover, von Lüttwitz screamed, dropping into the half-track as the first bombs fell. The lead Panther, 300 meters ahead, disappeared in a fountain of earth and flame. A 1,000-pound bomb had struck directly beside it, the concussion flipping the 30-ton tank onto its side like a child's toy. Before von Lüttwitz could process what he'd seen, the second bomb hit, then the third, then a dozen more, explosions walking through his column with methodical precision. Then came the guns. The sound was distinctive, unforgettable, like heavy canvas tearing, but amplified 1,000 times. 8 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, all firing simultaneously, 4,800 rounds per minute of combined fire. The mathematical reality was simple. Every 2-second burst put 160 half-inch bullets into a target area, the size of a truck. Von Lüttwitz watched a half-track ahead explode as tracer rounds converged on it. The vehicle didn't just stop, it disintegrated, torn apart by concentrated firepower that exceeded anything ground-based machine guns could deliver. Men tumbled from the wreckage, some running, some not moving at all. The first wave pulled up after their attack run, engines roaring as they climbed back to altitude. Von Lüttwitz grabbed his binoculars with shaking hands, hoping that was the end of it. It wasn't. The second wave was already diving. Another 48 P-47s following the exact same attack profile, and behind them, he felt his stomach drop. A third wave, and a fourth. His radio exploded with panicked transmissions. Under air attack, grid 45729. Cannot move, Jabots everywhere, medical assistance required, heavy casualties, request permission to disperse into forest. Von Lüttwitz stared at the sky, now filled with aircraft at every altitude. Low-level attackers screaming past at treetop height, medium-altitude bombers rolling into their dives, high cover circling above, waiting their turn, and on the horizon, more waves approaching. He started counting again, lost track at 120. Kept seeing more. His adjutant Hauptmann Kruger climbed into the half-track, face pale. Herr Oberst, What are your orders? Von Lüttwitz continued staring at the sky. The sound was continuous now. Engines, explosions, that terrible ripping sound of massed machine guns. His carefully organized column was scattering, vehicles burning, men abandoning equipment to flee into the forest. Orders, he finally said, voice hollow. The Americans have 1,200 P-47s based in France. I thought it was propaganda, a number meant to frighten us. Another wave, more explosions, more of his vehicles burning. It wasn't propaganda, he whispered. 7 days ago, in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, this had all seemed so simple. He remembered the briefing, warm room, confident voices, schnapps being passed around. The meteorologist had shown them weather maps. A solid week of fog predicted, maybe more, perfect conditions for an offensive when your enemy owned the skies. American air superiority is irrelevant if they cannot fly, the general major had said to approving nods and confident laughter. Von Lüttwitz had raised his glass to the P-47 Thunderbolt sleeping in France while we take Belgium. They'd all laughed. The fat American fighter dismissed by Luftwaffe pilots as clumsy and crude, too heavy to maneuver, too large to hide, built by a nation that valued comfort over combat effectiveness. The Jug, short for Juggernaut, a name that seemed more insult than compliment. Let them come, he'd thought. If they can even find us through the fog. Now, watching another wave of Thunderbolts roll into their attack dive, von Lüttwitz understood the terrible truth. The weather had protected them, but weather always changes. And when it did, the Americans hadn't sent a squadron or a group. They'd sent an entire air force. A fifth wave was approaching from the east. He could see a sixth behind it. The sky belonged to them now. Every altitude, every direction, continuous waves with no gaps between attacks. One group would depart as another arrived, creating an unending cycle of destruction. An explosion closer this time. His own half-track rocked from the concussion. Kruger was shouting something about dispersing, about retreating into the forest, but von Lüttwitz barely heard him. He was counting aircraft again. 130, 140, still more coming. The Americans hadn't sent their air force to support their ground troops. They'd sent it to erase his division from existence. And somewhere in the crystalline blue sky above Bastogne, the fat Thunderbolts they'd laughed at were doing exactly that. The contempt had begun 18 months earlier, in the spring of 1943, when Luftwaffe pilots first encountered the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt over occupied Europe. Major Heinz Baer, a veteran ace with over 200 victories, had returned from a mission shaking his head in disbelief. The Americans have built a fighter that weighs as much as a small bomber, he told his intelligence officers. It flies like a freight train and turns like an ocean liner. Our 90s can fly circles around it. The assessment spread through German fighter squadrons like gospel. Here was proof of American industrial incompetence, building quantity over quality, mass over maneuverability, brute force over finesse. The P-47 became a joke in Luftwaffe ready rooms. Pilots called it die Kiste, the crate, or Milchkanne, the milk can. Some nicknamed it der Dicker, after Hermann Goering himself, a cruel comparison that suggested both were bloated, slow, and past their prime. German intelligence officers compiled reports that seemed to confirm the prejudices. The P-47 weighed 10,000 pounds empty, nearly 50% more than the sleek Focke-Wulf 90. It stood 14 feet tall, presenting a massive target profile. Its rate of climb was mediocre compared to German interceptors. In turning combat, the traditional measure of fighter superior, it was hopelessly outclassed. 8 machine guns because they cannot aim properly, one Luftwaffe colonel observed dismissively. American excess compensating for American inadequacy. What German analysts failed to understand was that the P-47 wasn't designed to dogfight. It was designed to survive, to carry heavy ordnance, to operate at extreme altitudes, and to bring its pilots home. The massive weight they mocked was armor protection. The bulk they ridiculed was a turbo supercharger that maintained power at 40,000 feet. The 8 guns they dismissed could destroy an aircraft in a 2-second burst. But prejudice is easier than analysis, and the Germans chose prejudice. By late 1943, when P-47s began shifting from high-altitude escort to ground attack roles, German ground forces initially shared the Luftwaffe's contempt. Early attacks were unimpressive. Bombs fell wide, rockets scattered harmlessly, and pilots seemed hesitant to press attacks through flak. The American fighter, pretending to be a bomber, Wehrmacht officers joked, proof they have failed at air combat and must attack targets that cannot shoot back. This dismissal would prove catastrophic. What the Germans witnessed in 1943 were pilots learning a new mission. By 1944, they would face pilots who had perfected it. The attacks that seemed amateurish in summer 1943 would become surgical strikes by summer 1944. But German commanders, comfortable in their assumptions, never adjusted their threat assessment. By Bastogne, P-47 remained a joke, even as it was becoming a nightmare. When Hitler conceived Operation Vocht am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive, in November 1944, the weather became his secret weapon. Historical data showed that the Ardennes experienced dense fog and low clouds throughout December and January. Meteorologists confirmed the pattern would likely hold. 7 to 10 days of poor visibility was expected, perhaps more. American technology is meaningless when aircraft cannot fly. Field Marshal Walter Model told his commanders, "We learned this in Russia. Winter neutralizes enemy air power. We will use the same strategy here." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Launch the offensive during predicted bad weather, advance rapidly while Allied aircraft sat grounded, reach the Meuse River before weather cleared, then consolidate positions and dare the Americans to counterattack. The P-47s that dominated summer skies would be irrelevant. Victory would belong to whoever moved fastest on the ground. At the final pre-offensive briefing on December 12, 1944, German officers reviewed the weather forecasts with satisfaction. Fog was predicted for December 16 through 24, at minimum. Smiles spread around the table. Schnapps was poured. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, who would lead the spearhead, raised his glass with theatrical flourish. "Gentlemen, give me good weather and I will give you Antwerp in bad weather." The room erupted in laughter at the paradox. Another officer added, "The Americans may have 1,200 P-47s in France, but 1,200 grounded aircraft equals zero threat." Von Lüttwitz himself had joined the mockery. The fat Thunderbolt rules the summer sky. But winter belongs to Germany. They toasted to German ingenuity, to tactical brilliance, to the weather gods who had delivered fog exactly when needed. No one considered what would happen if the forecast was wrong. No one planned for clear skies. Why would they? The P-47 was a joke. American pilots were inexperienced, and ground attack doctrine was still experimental. Even if weather cleared, German forces would be too dispersed, too fast-moving, too deep into Allied territory for effective air interdiction. These were the assumptions, these were the beliefs, and every single one would prove catastrophically wrong. What German commanders didn't know, what their intelligence had completely failed to discover, was that by December 1944, the P-47 had evolved from mediocre escort fighter into the most effective ground attack aircraft in history. American pilots had perfected tactics during the Normandy campaign that could destroy entire columns in minutes. Forward air controllers were embedded with ground units, providing real-time targeting. Radio coordination was seamless. Armed reconnaissance missions meant P-47s actively hunted German vehicles rather than waiting for assignments. Every pilot had been trained specifically for ground interdiction. Every aircraft was optimized for the mission. The force structure was overwhelming, over 1,200 P-47s operational in the European theater, concentrated in France and Belgium within 10 minutes flight time of the Ardennes. When weather permitted, they could launch 3,000 sorties daily. They had unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited replacement aircraft, and they were waiting. While fog grounded them, American ground crews loaded ordnance, armed guns, and pre-flighted aircraft. Pilots studied maps of the Ardennes, memorized German assembly areas, reviewed radio frequencies for coordination with ground forces. Intelligence officers marked every German unit position, every supply depot, every crossroad. They knew the offensive was coming. They knew where German forces were concentrated. And they knew that the moment weather cleared, they would launch the largest tactical air operation of the war. On December 22nd, meteorologists delivered new forecasts to both sides. A high-pressure system was moving in from the west. The fog would lift. Clear skies were predicted for December 23rd. For the Americans, this was the signal they'd been waiting for. Alert orders went out. Maximum effort. All available aircraft, continuous operation. For the Germans, the news triggered panic in some headquarters, dismissal in others. Some commanders ordered immediate dispersal. Others ignored the forecast, assuming it would be wrong like so many before. Von Lüttwitz was in the latter category. He'd been advancing successfully for 6 days. Bastogne was within reach. Why stop now based on a weather prediction that might not materialize? Besides, even if it cleared, what could the Americans really do? His forces were spread across 50 miles of front. They were moving fast. They were in forests. The P-47s would have to find them first. He went to sleep on the night of December 22nd, still confident. The Americans had 1,200 P-47s. Yes, but surely that was exaggeration. Propaganda meant to intimidate. And even if true, 1,200 aircraft couldn't be everywhere at once, he would deal with air attacks when they came. If they came, the fog had protected them for a week. Perhaps it would return before the Americans could exploit any clearing. These were his thoughts as he drifted to sleep. By 0:45 hours on December 23rd, watching wave after wave of P-47 Thunderbolts fill the sky above his burning column, von Lüttwitz understood that every assumption had been wrong. Every dismissal had been fatal. Every joke had been hubris. The Americans didn't have 1,200 P-47. They had 1,200 operational P-47s ready to fly. And they'd sent every single one. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt that German generals had dismissed represented American industrial might at its absolute peak. Designed by Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who understood that survival mattered more than elegance, the P-47 was conceived as a brute force solution to high-altitude combat. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing 2,000 horsepower or 2,500 with water injection, was the most reliable power plant of the war. While German engines required frequent maintenance and often failed in extreme conditions, the R2800 simply ran, in bitter cold, scorching heat, through battle damage that would have destroyed liquid-cooled engines. The massive radial kept turning. This reliability became the P-47's greatest weapon. Not spectacular performance, but the certainty that it would start every morning and bring its pilot home every night. The armament German officers mocked as excessive was actually calculated lethality. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, created a cone of destruction that required only approximate aim. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute, meaning all 8 together delivered 4,800 rounds per minute. 80 rounds every second. A 2-second burst put 160 half-inch bullets into a target area, each round capable of penetrating armor, exploding fuel tanks, or severing control cables. The Germans preferred cannons for their explosive power, but cannons carried limited ammunition and required precise aim. The P-47's guns could fire for 25 seconds continuously, allowing pilots to engage multiple targets or correct aim mid-burst. In ground attack, this sustained firepower was devastating. A single P-47 could strafe an entire convoy, walking fire down the column until ammunition was exhausted. For ground attack missions, P-47s carried external ordnance that transformed them into flying artillery. 2,000-pound bombs, under the wings plus one 500-pound bomb under the fuselage delivered 2,500 pounds of high explosive equivalent to a medium bomber's load. Alternatively, 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets could be mounted, each packing the punch of a 105mm artillery shell. The HVR could penetrate tank armor at the right angle, making the P-47 dangerous even to Germany's heaviest panzers. This combination heavy bombs, armor-penetrating rockets and sustained machine gun fire meant a single P-47 could engage any target from supply trucks to Tiger tanks. By December 1944, American factories had produced over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts, with production peaking at one aircraft every 90 minutes. Republic Aviation's plants in Farmingdale, New York and Evansville, Indiana operated 24 hours daily, employing workers who'd never built aircraft before the war, but now assembled complex fighters with precision that matched pre-war standards. Each P-47 cost $85,000, expensive by American standards, astronomical by German, but the United States was producing them faster than combat could destroy them. The European theater alone fielded 1,200 operational P-47s by December 1944, organized into dozens of fighter groups spread across France, Belgium and southern England. The IAC Tactical Air Command, responsible for supporting ground forces, operated over 800 P. The IAC Fighter Command added another 400. Every aircraft was maintained to exacting standards, with spare parts flowing from American factories in quantities that seemed unlimited. When a P-47 was damaged, it was repaired overnight or replaced within days. German forces fought with dwindling resources, cannibalizing aircraft for parts, flying missions on minimal fuel. Americans fought with abundance. The tactical doctrine German commanders dismissed as amateurish had actually been perfected through brutal trial and error in Normandy. American pilots learned that ground attack required different skills than air combat: lower altitudes, faster target acquisition, precise bombing and immediate escape before flak could respond. Forward air controllers, specially trained officers embedded with ground units, revolutionized coordination. A-face carried radios tuned to aircraft frequencies, marking targets with colored smoke and directing strikes in real time. This eliminated the delay between target identification and attack, allowing P-47s to respond to ground developments within minutes. Armed reconnaissance missions sent P-47s hunting for targets of opportunity rather than waiting for assignments. Pilots flew designated routes, attacking anything military they spotted: convoys, trains, supply dumps, troop concentrations. This constant presence meant German forces could rarely move safely in daylight. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers learned that movement meant death, that clear skies meant air attacks, that the distinctive sound of R-2800 engines meant they had seconds to find cover. The weather that had protected German forces during the offensive's first week was both blessing and curse. From December 16 through 22, dense fog and low clouds grounded most Allied air operations. The few brave or desperate missions flew, but weather conditions made effective attack nearly impossible. German forces advanced 50 miles during this period, achieving surprise and initial success. But while aircraft sat grounded, American preparation intensified. Ground crews worked through fog, loading bombs and rockets onto every available aircraft. Ordnance trucks made continuous runs from ammunition depots. Fuel trucks topped off tanks. Maintenance crews performed inspections and repairs. By December 22, 1,200 P-47s sat on airfields across France and Belgium, fully armed, fully fueled, and ready to launch within 30 minutes of receiving clear weather forecasts. Pilots had been briefed repeatedly on German positions, road networks, and priority targets. Intelligence officers had mapped every German unit, every supply route, every choke point. The Americans weren't just waiting for weather to clear, they were preparing to unleash coordinated devastation. The meteorological forecast that reached both sides on December 22nd proved accurate. A high-pressure system moving from the west would bring clear skies to the Ardennes by morning of December 23rd. For American commanders, this was the moment they'd prepared for. Orders went out immediately. Maximum effort, all available aircraft, continuous operations until further notice. Fighter groups received target assignments. Bomb loads were confirmed. Radio frequencies were verified. By midnight on December 22nd, the largest tactical air operation of the war was ready to launch at first light. For German commanders, the forecast triggered varied responses. Some ordered immediate dispersal into forests. Others ignored it, assuming forecasts would prove wrong, as they often had. Most, like von Lüttwitz, had become complacent after a week of successful advances under fog protection. Even those who took the forecast seriously underestimated what was coming. They expected air attacks, unpleasant but manageable. They expected losses, acceptable if the offensive continued. What none of them expected was 1,200 P-47 Thunderbolts filling the sky in coordinated waves, attacking every German position simultaneously, turning the entire Ardennes into a killing ground where movement meant death and survival meant hiding. The weather cleared at dawn on December 23rd. Within 90 minutes, the sky belonged entirely to the Americans, and the Thunderbolts they'd laughed at were writing the Battle of the Bulge's final chapter in fire and blood. December 23rd, 1944, began with crystalline silence. The fog that had shrouded the Ardennes for 7 days lifted like a curtain rising on a stage, revealing a landscape of snow-covered forests, narrow roads packed with German vehicles, and cloudless blue sky stretching to every horizon. At American air bases across France and Belgium, the silence shattered at 0730 hours when klaxons sounded and ground crews sprinted to waiting aircraft. Engines coughed, caught, and roared to life. 1,200 Pratt & Whitney radials hammered the morning air with thunder. By 0800 hours, the first wave was airborne, 96 P-47 Thunderbolts climbing into crystal air, their silver wings catching sunlight as they turned east toward Belgium. Behind them, second and third waves were already taxiing. The operation had begun. Von Lüttwitz's column was among the first to die. At 0845, 48 P-47s from the 32nd 2nd Fighter Group rolled inverted at 12,000 feet and dove on the road junction his division occupied. Lead aircraft released bombs at 3,000 feet, 2,000-pounders that fell with mathematical precision. The first struck directly beside the lead Panther tank, the blast wave flipping 30 tons of armor like a child's toy. Subsequent bombs walked through the column in 3-second intervals, each explosion adding to a curtain of fire and steel that transformed organized military formation into scattered burning wreckage. Then came the strafing runs. P-47s pulled out of their dives at treetop level, 850 caliber guns per aircraft, hammering targets at point-blank range. The sound was distinctive, terrible, like massive cloth tearing, but amplified until it drowned out explosions and screams. German vehicles disintegrated under concentrated fire. Half-tracks exploded as fuel tanks ignited. Supply trucks shredded into fragments. Men who seconds earlier had been advancing confidently toward Bastogne were now running for forest cover or lying motionless in blood-stained snow. The attack lasted 90 seconds. When the first wave pulled up and turned west, 34 vehicles were burning and von Lüttwitz's offensive capability had effectively ceased to exist. But this was only the beginning. The second wave arrived before smoke had cleared from the first attack. Another 48 P-47s, another 90 seconds of bombs and guns, another dozen vehicles destroyed, then the third wave, then the fourth. German radio networks exploded with panic transmissions from every unit along the 50-mile front. Under air attack, Grid 547 cannot move, jubbos everywhere. Require immediate air support. Medical evacuation impossible, too many casualties. Luftwaffe headquarters received desperate pleas for fighter cover, but the handful of German aircraft that attempted to intervene were intercepted by high-flying P-51 Mustangs before reaching the battlefield. The sky belonged entirely to the Americans, and they intended to keep it. Forward air controllers embedded with American ground units began directing strikes with surgical precision. Red Leader F-Ike Charlie, target column moving south on Highway N4, marking with yellow smoke now. Seconds later, P-47s rolled into attack dives, bombs falling exactly where requested. This coordination between ground and air forces was something German doctrine had never achieved. American pilots and ground forces operated as single integrated weapon system, responding to threats within minutes of identification. The tactical innovation that devastated German forces was the relay system. Fighter groups operated in continuous rotation. As one group expended ordnance and returned to base, another arrived over the battlefield. Gaps between waves lasted only minutes, creating impression of endless attacks. German soldiers learned that clear skies meant continuous air presence, that movement meant death, that survival required abandoning vehicles and equipment to hide in forest. Psychological impact was immense, and immediate units that had advanced confidently for a week suddenly refused to move in daylight. Officers' orders were ignored as self-preservation overcame discipline. Entire battalions scattered into woods, leaving tanks and vehicles abandoned on roads. The offensive momentum that had carried German forces 50 miles in 7 days stopped completely in 7 hours. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne Division watched in amazement as the sky filled with aircraft. For 6 days they'd held against overwhelming German forces with dwindling ammunition and supplies. Now C-47 transport aircraft appeared overhead, escorted by swarms of P-47s dropping supply bundles with remarkable accuracy. 50 tons of ammunition, medical supplies and food descended under colored parachutes, while Thunderbolts circled protectively, ready to attack any German unit that threatened the operation. The supply drop achieved 95% accuracy, nearly every bundle landing within American perimeter. German forces attempting to interfere were immediately struck by diving P. The siege of Bastogne had not been broken, but the besieged were now being resupplied while besiegers hid from American air power. The strategic balance had reversed. Throughout the morning and afternoon of December 23, P-47s struck every German position across the entire Ardennes front. Fuel dumps erupted in towering fireballs. Supply columns were destroyed on narrow forest roads, burning vehicles blocking routes and trapping following units. Artillery positions were silenced by precision bombing, headquarters buildings were leveled, communication centers were obliterated. The systematic destruction was enabled by excellent intelligence. American reconnaissance had mapped every significant German position during the foggy advance. Now, with clear weather, that intelligence became targeting data. German commanders discovered they had no safe location. Forest provided concealment from ground observation, but were transparent to aircraft overhead. Villages offered shelter, but became obvious bombing targets. Movement attracted immediate attack. Remaining stationary meant waiting to be found. The operational paralysis was total. By 1600 hours on December 23, German offensive operations had ceased entirely. Units that had been advancing were now desperately trying to disperse and survive. The weather that was supposed to protect them for 7 days had lasted exactly 7 days, but clearing skies proved more devastating than anyone had imagined. The Luftwaffe's attempt to contest American air superiority on December 23 was brief and disastrous. Approximately 100 German fighters were scrambled throughout the day. Most were intercepted by American fighter escorts before reaching ground attack aircraft. Those few that penetrated to the P-47 formations discovered that the fat American fighter they'd dismissed could defend itself effectively. Several P-47s, despite carrying heavy bomb loads, engaged and destroyed German interceptors. The Thunderbolts' 850 caliber guns proved lethal in head-on attacks. and its armor allowed it to absorb damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 37 aircraft while shooting down exactly 3 P-47s, a 12-to-1 loss ratio that made further intervention suicidal. German fighters would make only token appearances for the remainder of the battle. The sky belonged to American air power, and it would remain theirs until the war ended. Von Lüttwitz sat in a frozen dugout that evening, writing his situation report by candlelight. His division, which had numbered 47 vehicles that morning, now possessed 11 operational vehicles, and perhaps 60% of its combat personnel. The remainder were dead, wounded, scattered, or simply missing. Similar reports flooded German headquarters from every unit. The offensive that had terrified Allied command a week earlier was collapsing not from ground combat but from air power that German planning had dismissed as irrelevant. 1,200 P-47 Thunderbolts had appeared over the Ardennes on December 23. They would return on December 24, 25, 26, every day that weather permitted, continuing the systematic destruction until German forces retreated or surrendered. The generals who had laughed at the P-47 were no longer laughing. They were dying. The destruction unleashed on December 23 was merely the opening act of a sustained air campaign that would continue until German forces retreated or were annihilated. On December 24, Christmas Eve, the weather remained clear and American aircraft flew even more sorties than the previous day. 1,300 missions were launched by IEC Tactical Air Command alone, with P-47s accounting for the majority. German soldiers, exhausted and demoralized after a day of continuous air attack, discovered there would be no respite. The Americans were flying through Christmas, attacking with the same intensity, showing no mercy despite the holiday. German troops who had been told that sentimental Americans would never fight on Christmas Day learned otherwise as bombs fell and machine guns chattered throughout December 25. The psychological message was clear. This was industrial warfare, and industrial processes did not observe holidays or show compassion. By December 26, when Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, the siege had become almost irrelevant. German forces surrounding the town were so battered by air attacks that they could barely maintain defensive positions, much less prevent a relief column from breaking through. The statistical accounting of destruction told a story that changed military doctrine permanently. Between December 23 and December 26, American tactical aircraft flew over 10,000 sorties across the Ardennes front. P-47s alone accounted for approximately 2,500 of these missions. The ordnance delivered was staggering: over 2,000 tons of bombs, 15,000 rockets, and millions of machine gun rounds. German losses attributed directly to air attack exceeded 400 vehicles destroyed, 100 tanks and self-propelled guns eliminated, and an estimated 2,000 casualties inflicted. Beyond direct destruction, the indirect effects were even more devastating. German units consumed fuel attempting to disperse and hide rather than advance. Supply columns were destroyed faster than replacements could be organized. Communication networks were disrupted by attacks on headquarters. Artillery units were silenced. Medical evacuation became impossible in daylight. The cumulative effect was operational paralysis. German forces could not attack, could not effectively defend, could not retreat safely, and could not sustain themselves logistically. The Battle of the Bulge's ultimate outcome was determined by multiple factors: American ground forces' stubborn defense, Patton's rapid counterattack, German fuel shortages, and strategic overextension. But air power's contribution was decisive. The offensive that had advanced 50 miles in 7 days under fog protection gained almost no ground in the 7 days after weather cleared. German commanders repeatedly cited air attacks as the primary obstacle preventing continued operations. General Oberst Jodl, in his post-war interrogation, admitted that clear weather on December 23 sealed the offensive's fate because German forces could not maneuver or concentrate under Allied air superiority. Model, who had commanded the operation, stated simply, "When the weather cleared, we were finished." The P-47 Thunderbolt, dismissed 18 months earlier as crude and ineffective, had proven to be the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. Its combination of heavy armament, armor protection, reliability and payload capacity made it ideal for the close air support mission. More importantly, American industry had produced them in quantities that made losses irrelevant. Every P-47 shot down was replaced within days. Every pilot lost was succeeded by another with equal training. The strategic implications extended far beyond the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge consumed Germany's last operational reserves: men, tanks, fuel and ammunition that could never be replaced. These resources, squandered in a failed offensive, were desperately needed on the Eastern Front where Soviet armies were preparing their final assault. The losses inflicted by American air power accelerated Germany's collapse by months. Additionally, the Wehrmacht's confidence was shattered. Soldiers who survived the air attacks carried psychological scars that affected their combat effectiveness for the remainder of the war. German forces learned that movement in daylight meant death, that concentration invited destruction, and that American technological superiority was insurmountable. This demoralization spread through units, contributing to the rapid German collapse in spring 1945. Officers who had once believed in ultimate victory now understood that defeat was inevitable and imminent. The Battle of the Bulge validated tactical aviation doctrine that would shape warfare for decades. The integration of ground and air forces through forward air controllers became standard practice in all modern militaries. The concept of air superiority as prerequisite for ground operations became accepted wisdom. The P-47's success in ground attack led to development of specialized close air support aircraft. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, named in honor of its predecessor, would embody the same philosophy of heavy armor, heavy armament and reliability. The lessons were clear. Air power could not win wars independently, but ground forces could not operate effectively without it. The coordination achieved in the Ardennes became the model for combined arms warfare that defines modern military operations. Nations that ignored these lessons paid dearly in subsequent conflicts. For the P-47 specifically, the Ardennes campaign cemented its reputation as one of history's great warplanes. The aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots had mocked as Die Kiste ended the war credited with destroying more ground targets than any other Allied fighter: over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. In air combat, despite being optimized for ground attack by 1944, P-47s still destroyed 3,700 enemy aircraft. The production total of 15,686 aircraft made it the most numerous American fighter of the war. Its loss rate, approximately 4%, was among the lowest of any combat aircraft, testament to its ruggedness and survivability. Pilots who flew it developed fierce loyalty to the aircraft that brought them home, despite damage that would have destroyed other fighters. The P-47's combat record vindicated every design decision that German analysts had criticized. The weight was armor that saved lives. The size accommodated systems that increased capability. The 8 guns delivered firepower that no enemy could withstand. Von Lüttwitz survived the Battle of the Bulge and eventually became a prisoner of war. In post-war interviews, he reflected on the offensive's failure with bitter clarity. "We gambled everything on weather that we could not control. When it cleared, we faced technological superiority we could not match, and industrial capacity we could not overcome." The P-47 Thunderbolt, which we had dismissed as a crude American fighter, destroyed my division in hours. I learned that modern warfare is won by factories and resources, not by courage or tactical skill. The nation that builds 1,200 advanced aircraft and trains 1,200 skilled pilots to fly them will always defeat the nation that cannot. His assessment captured the fundamental lesson of the Ardennes campaign and the wider war. Industrial capacity, properly applied, was the decisive factor in modern conflict. Germany had fought with excellence and determination, but excellence could not overcome abundance backed by technology. The 1,200 P-47s that appeared over Belgium on December 23rd represented American power that no amount of German skill or courage could defeat. The generals who had laughed at the Thunderbolt learned their error in the most terrible way possible, not through argument or demonstration, but through the systematic destruction of their armies beneath skies filled with the aircraft they had dismissed. The laughter had stopped. It would never return. January 15, 1945. 3 weeks after the sky had filled with silver aircraft, Oberst Friedrich von Lüttwitz sat in a prisoner of war compound in Luxembourg, staring through chain-link fence at the cloudy winter sky. Around him, hundreds of German soldiers huddled in inadequate coats, waiting for processing, for transfer, for the war to finally end. Most had been captured during the chaotic German retreat that followed the failed Ardennes Offensive. Many bore injuries not from ground combat but from air attacks, burns, shrapnel wounds, psychological trauma that made them flinch at the sound of aircraft engines. Von Lüttwitz held a scrap of paper, a letter he'd been writing to his wife. The words came slowly, painfully, as he tried to explain what had happened to his division, to the offensive, to Germany's last hope for negotiated peace. "We advanced 50 miles in 7 days, he'd written. "We were stopped in 7 hours. How could he make her understand? How could anyone who hadn't witnessed it comprehend the totality of what 1,200 aircraft could achieve? An American P-47 flew overhead, low enough that von Lüttwitz could see the invasion stripes on its wings, the belly-mounted bomb still attached. The aircraft was heading east, probably toward the Rhine, where German forces were now desperately trying to establish defensive positions. Von Lüttwitz watched it pass, that distinctive sound of the R-2800 engine triggering memories he would carry forever. The sound of bombs falling, the ripping cloth chatter of 50-caliber guns, the screams of men burning in vehicles that had become coffins. His hands shook slightly as he returned to his letter. "I remember December 16th, he wrote. "We were so confident. The fog protected us. We laughed at American technology that could not function in poor weather. We toasted to the P-47 Thunderbolt, sleeping in France while we took Belgium. The laughter stopped on December 23rd. It will never return." He paused, ink drying on the pen's tip, remembering the officers' mess 7 days before the offensive launched. The warmth, the schnapps, the absolute certainty that they understood warfare better than their enemies. How quickly certainty had turned to ash. A young German soldier, barely 18, approached hesitantly. "Herr Oberst, is it true what they say, that the Americans have thousands of these aircraft?" Von Lüttwitz looked at the boy. He would always think of him as a boy, though the Wehrmacht called him a soldier. "Thousands," he confirmed quietly, "and they can afford to lose hundreds and still maintain superiority. We cannot afford to lose dozens. That is the mathematics of this war. But our pilots, our tactics, surely we are superior in skill." The boy's voice carried desperate hope, the last refuge of soldiers who had lost everything else. Von Lüttwitz shook his head slowly. "Skill matters when forces are equal. When one side has 1,200 aircraft and the other has 12, skill becomes irrelevant. When one side can replace every loss within days and the other cannot replace any loss at all, superiority means nothing. We fought industrial capacity with tactical excellence. Excellence lost." The boy walked away, shoulders slumped, and von Lüttwitz returned to his letter. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that the weapon which destroyed them wasn't particularly revolutionary? The P-47 wasn't faster than German fighters. It wasn't more maneuverable. It wasn't equipped with secret weapons or mysterious technology. It was simply good enough, produced in overwhelming numbers, flown by adequately trained pilots, and supported by logistics that never failed. American victory wasn't achieved through genius or innovation. It was achieved through abundance, backed by competence. Germany had no answer to that combination. He thought of the Luftwaffe pilots who had first encountered P-47s in 1943, who had returned mocking its bulk and clumsiness. He thought of the intelligence reports that dismissed American industrial production as wasteful excess. He thought of his own words at that December briefing. "The fat thunderbolt rules the summer sky. Winter belongs to Germany." Every assessment had been wrong. Every dismissal had been fatal. Every joke had been hubris. The Americans had built an aircraft that wasn't the best fighter or the best bomber, but was good enough at both missions to dominate the battlefield. They'd produced it in quantities that made German production look artisanal. They'd trained pilots adequately rather than excellently, understanding that 1,200 adequate pilots would always defeat 12 excellent ones. And most devastatingly, they'd integrated air and ground forces so completely that the distinction between them had dissolved into single weapon system. That evening, as darkness fell over the prisoner compound, von Lüttwitz finished his letter. "The war is lost," he wrote, "not because we lacked courage or skill, but because we faced an enemy who could afford to make mistakes and still prevail through sheer material superiority. We laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt because we did not understand what it represented. It was not a fighter or a bomber. It was American industrial might given wings. We could shoot down 10 and 20 more would appear. We could destroy 50, and 100 more would be built. We fought machines that could be replaced. They fought men who could not. Tell our sons, when this is over, that the next war will not be won by the bravest soldiers or the cleverest generals. It will be won by the nation, with the most factories, the most resources, and the wisdom to use both effectively. He signed the letter, knowing military censors would read it before it reached his wife, knowing they might redact portions but not caring. These truths needed to be recorded, needed to be remembered, needed to teach future generations what his generation had learned through blood and fire. Overhead, the sound of aircraft engines continued intermittently. American bombers heading east, American fighters patrolling, American transports bringing supplies. The sky had belonged to Germany once, years ago, in the early victories when the world seemed conquerable. Now it belonged to America, and would remain theirs until the war ended. The P-47 Thunderbolts that filled Belgian skies on December 23rd had not merely defeated a German offensive, they had demonstrated the future of warfare, where victory belonged to industrial powers that could sustain operations indefinitely, absorb losses without flinching, and apply technology at scale that made individual excellence irrelevant. Von Lüttwitz folded the letter carefully and handed it to a guard for mailing. He would survive the war, return to Germany, and spend his remaining years teaching at military academies. He would tell students about the Ardennes Offensive, about the fog that protected them, and the clear skies that destroyed them. He would explain that modern war is won, not on battlefields but in factories, not through courage but through capacity. And he would always remember December 23rd, 1944, when the sky filled with aircraft they had laughed at, and the laughter died forever. The 1,200 P-47 Thunderbolts that appeared that morning had written the final chapter of German offensive capability. The generals who dismissed them had learned too late that mockery was poor strategy against industrial might. By the time they understood their error, their armies were burning beneath wings they had called crude and pilots they had called incompetent. The fat American fighter had proven to be exactly what its designers intended, a weapon that brought overwhelming firepower, absorbed punishment, returned home reliably, and most importantly, existed in numbers that made victory inevitable. The Third Reich had gambled everything on weather it couldn't control, dismissed threats it didn't understand, and paid for both mistakes with its final reserves. When the smoke cleared and the counting was done, the Battle of the Bulge had cost Germany the war's last offensive capability, and the weapon that delivered that defeat was the aircraft German generals had laughed at 18 months earlier. History would remember the P-47 Thunderbolt not for being the best fighter, but for being good enough in sufficient numbers to reshape the battlefield completely. That lesson, written in fire across Belgian skies, would echo through military doctrine for generations. Von Lüttwitz understood it perfectly, sitting in that frozen compound, watching American aircraft own skies that would never again belong to Germany.